Good morning. Glad you can make it out today. Is there anything that you have as a prayer request, someone or something we need to pray for this morning? Of course, yes. Will you bow with me, please? Father in heaven, we thank you for this day you've given us, that we can come together as your children to study your word. Father, at this time we're really mindful of the Wright family as the passing of Glenna. We ask you to be with Lynn and Craig, Father, as they're mourning the loss of their wife and their mother. Father, comfort the family as only you can. Help us as their brothers and sisters to be there to help them, strengthen them, and give them comfort. Father, be with us as we study your word this morning, that the things that we say and do are pleasing and acceptable unto thee. In Christ's name, amen. For those of you who may not have heard, Glenna Wright passed away this past week. And there will be visitation today from 1 to 7 in Otisville. And the funeral will be tomorrow. We'll have those announcements later on, but for those of you who don't know, that Glenna did pass away this past week. We're in the book of Daniel. We got through a few verses last week. A little bit of a recap. We all know the story of Daniel and the lion's den and the fire furnace, but there's some build up to it before we get into that. The people of Judah have been captured by the Babylonians. King Nebuchadnezzar is the one that's overtaken them. He's also one that overtook the Assyrians, and we knew how bad of a people that they were. And King Nebuchadnezzar said, hey, let's take the best of these young people that I've captured, take the youth of them, the best looking ones, the strongest ones, the smartest ones, and we're going to train them. We'll train them for a few years, and then they'll be in my court. So he's trying to get the best of the best to help bolster his kingdom. And of course, we know Daniel and his three friends were some of the ones that were taken. And at the time that they were taken, do you know roughly how old they were, these young men, Daniel and his friends? Guesstimate? Everything I found was saying about 14, 15, 16 years old. They were young when they were taken. Granted, their people all got captured, and these young men were pulled aside with a group of others. They were about 14, 15 years old, in captivity, pulled aside by the king, and he's saying, you guys are now going to be eating the best of food. You're going to get the best of education. So everybody else, his family and that, he's pulled away from them, and now they're separated. But he's 14, 15 years old. Can you imagine being that age today, being pulled away from your family in a foreign country, a captive, and now you're treated differently than all the other captives around? So something's got to be going through these young men's mind of what's going to happen to me? Why am I pulled aside? But we see later on, and we can tell by the faith that these young men had, that they weren't too worried about it. That makes the story better. It really does. I mean, it's something, if you're 30-year-old, you kind of set in your ways. You hope you're locked into your faith, but 14, 15-year-olds, think of your kids being pulled away, something like that. How would they react? How would they respond to this? It's pretty amazing that as we read through Daniel, the story that happens of how strong in their faith that these young men were. It's very, very impressive. Like you said, it's a completely different look at this story. And in the process, they all had their name changed. The king wanted their name changed to separate them, pull them away from their Jewish background, pull them away from their religion to indoctrinate them into what he wants them to be. Hey, if you're named Daniel, we're now going to change you to Belshazzar. A harder name to say, but you're somebody different. You're no longer the person who you were. That's got to be hard for these guys. And as we could keep reading on, their names are between the four men. Daniel's always called Daniel in the book, but the other three it's gone back and forth of what they're called, and there's no real rhyme or reason that I found why sometimes they're called by their Jewish name, sometimes they're called by the name that Nebuchadnezzar gave them. And I couldn't find a real reason why that has happened. So we're going to continue on with this. Last week, I don't see Mark. Mark Bernor had a question. How many gods did Nebuchadnezzar have? How many did they serve there? And I found anywhere between 2,400 and 3,000 gods that they served. Unbelievable. And sometimes it seems like it's hard enough to stay locked and true to the one true God, to make sure we stay on the right and narrow path. But think if you had 3,000 gods that you worshiped. But really, we have that today. We don't have the names like they did in the back. Asher, Anu, Tiamat, Kingu. And they're the goddess of dragons, the god of the weather, the god of the scribes, the god of love, a god of wisdom. They've had all these different gods things. But there's gods out there people worship today, but we don't call them gods. There's money. There's physical pleasure. There's outdoor things that you do. They're not called gods, but they're put in front of God at times. And that's what people kind of worship. So we really have probably more than 3,000, but not specific names called God of. But they're out there, and people worship those things in front of the one and only God. Yes, Ted?
Hindus have at least 3 million gods.
3 million? Did everybody hear that?
Yeah.
The Hindus, about 3 million gods. Wow. How do you keep that straight? You have the ones that you want to worship. And of course, Mark comes in after I answered his question from last week. Yeah. About the number of gods, I found anywhere between 2,400 and 3,000 different gods that they have. Yes. Between 2,400 and 3,000. So, and God of, you name it. And Ted just mentioned that the Hindus have reported over 3 million that they worship. Terry.
Where I lived in Japan, they had the god of the local creek, the god of the little hill, the god of the fishing village, more than one of those. And each of these gods had their own little, kind of like shrine, which wasn't a church building. It was maybe a little thing a foot square on the side of a road. And when a person would go fishing from the fishing village near where I live, they would go to 5 or 6 of these because they didn't think of these gods like we have God who creates the heavens and the earth. They thought of these as local, fairly powerless gods, and if they got the favor of 5 or 6 of them, then maybe they would have a good day fishing. And that was a routine.
Wow.
That every day they would go to a number of these different places, and if they had a real good day, then those would be the gods they'd go back to the next time, stuff like that. But this was routine every day,
Wow.
and still is today for all that matter.
I mean, it's interesting the rut, if you will, that people get into, like you're saying, okay, I did good fishing today, so I'm going to keep doing this ritual to these 5. But what do they do if they have a bad day? Well, I want to drop you 5 and go to you 5 over here. And it's amazing where, well, you used the word powerless. They thought they were pretty much powerless, so they'd go to 2, 3, 4, 5 different ones. Whereas we've got the one God that is all powerful. We don't have to worry about him being powerless. We know the power that he has. He knows everything, can do anything, versus having to worship, 3 million, 2,000, whatever the number is, and do the rituals to 5, 6 different people to try to get a good fishing trip, to get a good hunt or anything like that. Yes, Terry.
I was teaching an English class at the Christian college that I was at over there, and one day we would always have one kid in the class or two that would be much better English than the others. And if the others wanted to ask a question that they didn't feel comfortable, they would have the one ask. Okay, so one day this kid raised his hand and he said, I don't understand what you're saying about God creating a baby in the womb of Mary. That's not possible. And I immediately thought of the title of a book, and I can't remember the guy right now, but I know some of you remember the name. The title of the book was Your God is Too Small. He was thinking of me having a God like those Japanese gods. And so I said back to him, your God is too small. And then I went on to talk about the God that created the sun and the moon and the stars, all the stars. And these kids were in college. They understood about the universe and galaxies and hundreds of millions of stars and all that kind of thing out there. And he heard that, and he got finished, and he thought for the right English word to say, and said finally, wow. I'm telling you, that's exactly what happened. He was thinking from his background of a weak God who couldn't dream of doing something like putting a child in a womb. And I was saying to him, you're in the wrong category of power here. A God that can create the whole
Good person to copy there, Terry. It's interesting that people who worship various gods like that their God is too small. And they can't do these things. And they say, well, your God can't do that. And it's only on the assumption because their God can't do that. And that's kind of what some of the stories lead through in here, Daniel, with what we'll see in a little bit. That their gods that they worshipped were too small. But the one true God, he isn't. Great conversation. Anything else before we move on? Daniel chapter 1, I think we're down around verse 8. We know the boys have had their name changed. We know that they're going to be getting fed differently, and we'll start off verse 8 all the way through 16. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank, so he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials, and the commander of the officials said to Daniel, I am afraid of the Lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. But Daniel said to the overseer whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Ezra, please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be observed in your presence and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food. And deal with your servants accordingly to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter, and he tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice foods. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and kept giving them vegetables. These young men, 14, 15 years old, kids, if I will, pulled away, having the opportunity to eat some of the best food around, don't want it. Daniel used the words here, he made up in his mind not to defile himself. How would he defile himself eating the king's food? It was worship to idols? I'm sorry? Maybe with pork? Yeah. Terry?
It may also have been meat in which there was blood in the meat. Who's couldn't do that?
Unclean food, unclean meat, improperly killed or cooked, sacrificed to idols. And it could also be like entering with a covenant that, hey, you're giving me all this. By me taking this, I'm agreeing with some of the things you're saying. All these are very viable and plausible. And the biggest one I found was like what Sherry said there of being sacrificed to idols. That one came up the most in the commentaries of if you had to pinpoint one, but there's probably a little bit of all of them in there. That, they had made up their mind beforehand, we're not going to do this. Now, I don't know, did they make up their mind of how they were going to act before they were offered the food? Not necessarily about eating, about how they were going to live their life in captivity now. Remember, all this stuff is being thrown at them one time after another. You're captured. Now you're pulled aside, separated from people. Now you're said you're going to eat the choice food. So did they make it? Once they got captured, did they say, no matter what happens, I'm going to live faithful and true to God? Or was it the next step? Oh, we're captured, now we're pulled aside. We're still going to stay faithful and true. Or was it once they got pulled aside and you're going to have the best meat? A lot's happening here. Now I'm going to start staying faithful and true. I think these young men made up their mind from the minute they got captured, no matter what happens, I'm going to stay faithful and true to God. I don't care what happens to me if it costs me my life. I'm going to stay faithful and true. That's my opinion of reading through the book of Daniel and how these men responded to every situation that happened to them from the very beginning to the end of the book of what was put in front of them, that they made the choice up front that no matter what happens, they were going to stay faithful to God. And by their actions, you can see that they did throughout the whole story. Would there have been anything wrong with them to eat that food that the king gave them? Is that a moral decision or what's the word I'm looking for?
I think to them,
to sin to them. As a moral decision or as the decision to stay faithful and true. That's where it would have been a sin to them. But if they didn't make that decision to not eat that food, would there have been anything wrong with eating it? That it was possibly sacrificed, that it had blood in it, would there have been anything wrong for these young men to eat that?
Are you saying separating from religion?
Separating it from religion, yes.
Well, there's a lot of cultures that aren't Jewish or Christian that have been very much against the eating of blood or drinking of blood. But, you know, I mean, if you take it away from all morality, then it's just food.
It's just food. So really, it's just food for the nourishment, but for their faithfulness and their religious belief, it was completely wrong. And as Brett said, it was definitely a sin to them if they would have took of it, if they would have ate of it.
In the ancient world, it wasn't just eating of blood, it was also the heart. And the heart would always have blood with it, okay? But in European ancient cultures, like the Norwegian and Swedish and the Viking era and that kind of thing, if you ate the heart of an animal, or even the heart of a man or woman, then you took into yourself their strength, their courage. Like eating the heart of a lion, you would have the strength of a lion or something like that. So there was a lot of, we call it pagan ideas about food that we don't believe today or think about today. But in those years, it was important to those people.
And that's one reason I think Daniel and them didn't eat of it, because they believed in Babylonia, if they partook of it, the people around would see that they were agreeing with their culture, their religion, and all of that, and that's one reason they didn't do it as well. They wanted to stay separate, that we are not like our captors. We are not like King Nebuchadnezzar. We are faithful to God. We don't believe that we should eat this because of whether it was, there was blood in it, it was sacrificed. So they wanted to make sure there was a distinction between them and the others that were around them. Later on in verse 8, Daniel had the courage to ask the commander of the officials that, hey, we really don't want to eat this best food that you're giving us. What kind of courage did that take for these young guys to say to the guy in charge of them, we don't want the good food your king's given us? He'd have to be very tactful. He'd have to use the right words to say to him, because this commander could have went to the king and said, these guys you got that you think are the best of the best, they don't want your food. I mean, it could have been off with their head just that quick. So Daniel had to have the courage and the wisdom, and we know him and the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were smart, because one of the reasons they pulled them aside, the king pulled them aside to help train them, to further them. So they had smarts about them. And when Daniel went to the commander, he knew how to approach them the right way to say, we really don't want to eat this. And the first response from the commander was, guys, the king said you got to have this. If you don't have it, it's going to be my head. If he sees you looking differently, my head's on the line. So no, you've got to eat this. So his answer was, no, you're going to eat this. But as we see, God always has his hands in everything here. And Daniel went to the next guy down, that was the one that was actually taking care of Daniel. And that was in verse 11. He went to the overseer, who the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel. So the commander put somebody else in charge of Daniel. So Daniel now goes a second time to this guy. Well, I didn't get what I wanted from mom. Let me go ask dad. It's like a little kid. But Daniel was staying firm in his faith, so he asked this other official, and he was kind of nervous about it too. But Daniel said, come on, test me out for a few days. Give us vegetables and water. It's not like he's asking for bad food. It's not like he's asking for something completely different, but he just wanted some vegetables and some water. Test us for 10 days and see how we look compared to the other people. And this overseer thought about it, And apparently he wasn't as scared of the king as the commander was, because if he was as afraid of the Nebuchadnezzar, he would have said, no, my head's on the line, you're going to eat what he said. But again, God had his hand in this, and the overseer said, sure, we'll test you for 10 days. And after 10 days, what happened? How did the boys look? Tom, yep, thumbs up. I mean, they look better. They actually look better than the ones that were eating the king's choice food. The Bible is saying, I think it's verse 13 or 14, they were fatter than the ones that were eating the king's choice food, just by eating vegetables and water. So parents, if you want your kids to eat vegetables, show them the story. That'll really get them to go. But, of course, I'm kidding on that. But God's hand is in Daniel's and his friends' lives this whole way through here. He's touching base, and he's making sure that their faithfulness is going to stay true, that because they're faithful to God, God is watching out for them. God is taking care of them. He's making sure they're going to get what they need, and they're going to get through this. And it's the faith of these young men that these things are coming through with God's hand in it. Because it could have been very easily, the commander could have turned these young men in, the overseer right below the commander could have turned these men in, and it would have been more than likely the loss of their life for them because of that. Yes, Brett?
Yeah, I think these commanders too were a little bit thrown off guard by this because, that's why it went to the two to make a decision, because I think, now that you say that these were young boys, well, these boys would have been a little intimidated by a commander and not ask these things, and I think that's why they picked them that young, because they'd be easily influenced to go with the flow.
Absolutely.
So this had to be different, like, hey, we don't have, what's going on here? We've never been asked this kind of question before, I'm gonna have what to do with somebody else here.
Exactly. I mean, as a captor, how many captors were given the king's choice food and wine? I don't think that happened every day. And for the commanders to see this, it might be common for them to see it that when Nebuchadnezzar conquered other nations, that he pulled the young men together and gave them the same choice food in that, because the king's trying to bolster his court. They might have seen that before. But I agree with Brett. This is probably the first time they've had the question, we don't want to eat this. Can you give us vegetables and water? And that would be very intimidating for a young man to ask a commander, and the commander say, now what do I do? Well, my head's on line, so I'm going to say no. Yes?
I was thinking if they decided, when they first were captive, that they were going to move, be faithful to God, that perhaps also in there that they, because they're being faithful to God, they have an idea that God's going to back them up.
Oh, absolutely. Did everybody hear that? I mean, that's part of our faith. We know that if we're faithful to God, He's going to take care of us. I mean, that's all part of it. And that's part of our faith. And even, we always hear the phrase, why do good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people? The bad things happen to good people not because of God. I don't believe God has a hand in bad things happening to us. That's not in His nature. Good things happen to us. But the thing, we have to remember that the things that are happening on this earth is not why we're faithful to God. It's what's after this earth. Ted.
I don't remember exactly, but Daniel was in Babylon most of his life, like 60 or 70 years.
Yes.
And I think that faith built over that time because it was very late in life. Some people say as late as 80 years old, which is throwing the lion's den. So we're talking of an increase in faith in the time he was a teenager up until he was a very old man.
Yeah. I mean, later on, I was going to get to that roughly in verse 19 or 20. The first year of Cyrus the king, Daniel had been in service to the king for about 70 years at that point, which, if he was 15, he'd put him about 85 years old, which is around the time of the lion's den as well. So you can imagine that. And his faithfulness the whole time, and then things like that happening. Anything else before we go on? Who here would turn down choice foods for vegetables and water when you're in prison. I mean, I'm sure there's many people in prison right now that wouldn't turn that down, but this was a different situation for these men because they know that they're being trained for several years. They know when this is done, they're going to be brought into the king's court and possibly be part and integral into that court. So they're being trained, and part of the training is you're going to get the best of the best. But these men stayed faithful to what they believed, and they denied themselves some of these choice things. But they were still had the education brought to them. They still had the teachings that they were going through, and but what's going to happen to them is still an unknown. But through all this, they're staying faithful to God and with everything that's going on around them.
Question that could be asked is, why didn't they ask for kosher meat? Seriously, I
True.
don't know the answer to that. That's the question.
I mean, is it because vegetables and water is easier to get to them than a kosher meat?
Or it's easier to make sure that it's kosher.
Or easier to make sure it's kosher, yeah. I mean, there's several different scenarios that could be to get to that point, but it is very interesting. I never thought of it that way, Ted. Terry.
I think there's an answer to that question.
To Ted's question?
To the business about, why couldn't they choose?
Oh,
This
okay.
wasn't a restaurant, they didn't have a menu. They
True.
brought out food for them to eat. And they didn't have a choice of what the food was or how it was prepared. And if they ate it, then this was the king's food and everybody's happy. But if they don't eat it, if they choose to not eat it, they're saying, I can't eat this because I don't know how it was prepared. I can't just eat it because it's placed in front of me. And so they say, can I have a different kind of menu?
They were tactful in the way they did it,
Yeah.
not to offend the people bringing it, not to offend the king.
But they were expected to eat what was put in front of them.
Absolutely,
And they said, we can't do that.
absolutely. Anything else before we go on? Verse 17. So we know these young men have decided to eat something different, and they're actually better off than the ones that were eating the king's choice food. 17 through 21. And as these four youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. Then at the end of the days which the king has specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king talked with them, and out of them all not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azra. Notice, they're old names. So they entered the king's personal service. And as for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in his realm. And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king, which, about to age Daniel, which was about 70 more years. So we're looking at Daniel at about 85 at the time of the end of Cyrus the king. But at this point here, he's still, 3 years later approximately, these guys are about 18, 19 years old. Now you're in the king's court. Now you're tested by the king. You're brought in before the king from the overseer. Can you imagine what's going through this overseer's mind, this commander? These guys wanted to eat different food. Okay. They look good, but how smart are they now? So his head's pretty much on the line too. He wasn't the one teaching them, but he's now the one presenting them to the king. And Nebuchadnezzar has a reputation of being knee-jerk reactionary and a little bit violent at times. So whoever's presenting all these young men to before him to how smart are they, they're kind of on the line too. But Daniel and his friends there kind of passed the test, and they did it with flying colors. It's interesting that every matter, not just a few, not just most, every matter the king questioned them on, Daniel and his friends stood out on. And they stood out so much, they're saying it's by 10 times as much. By men that have been in the king's court for years. They beat out men that the king had trusted for years by a landslide. And it states that, I want to make sure I get it right. Verse 17, God gave them knowledge. Yes, they went through the book learning, but God had his hand in these young men's lives with the knowledge and the things that they were learning. And Daniel himself also learned how to understand visions and dreams. Doesn't say that the other three did, it just points out that Daniel did. And later on, we're going to see how key it is for Daniel to have understood that. So after 3 years, these young men, they stood out head and shoulders above everybody else that they were trained with, along with, they stood out above the men that were already in the king's court, that were supposed to be his inner group that he consulted with when he had questions. And it's pretty amazing for 18-year-old, 19-year-old men in a foreign country, taught for 3 years to understand the ways of how well they stood out amongst everybody else there. So we can see that God firmly had his hand in these young men's lives with what they were going through. There's another story in the Bible about a young man who was taken away from his family, who actually sold from his family and got into the king's court, which was Joseph. And we a little bit of parallel here between these things. Yes, Joseph got there in a different way than what Daniel and his friends did into the king's court, but it's kind of a little bit of parallel there, that how God had his hand in Joseph's life with what happened to him and where he started being a prisoner, then sold, and where he wound up in the king's court with how Daniel and his friends wound up in the same situation. So we can see that God has his hand in everything that's going on in his children's lives. Any questions?
Yeah, at 17 here, be able to, God gave Daniel the ability to understand visions and dreams, to be able to predict the future.
I wouldn't say to predict the future, but he could understand.
What would that mean? Visions and dreams.
If somebody has a vision or a dream, which we'll read on shortly, he'll be able to understand and interpret what that dream means.
Just like Joseph. In Genesis.
Joseph, yeah, with the famine.
He
The-
said, I got these cows
Well,
and this corn and this, different things.
yes, it's predicting the future about what the dream means. The dream is saying there's going to be 7 year famine. He's not saying, hey guys, there's just going to be 7 year famine just by saying he knows it. It's interpreting of what the dream means. And dream is saying in the future there's going to be 7 years of feast and there's going to be 7 years of famine. It's just not him coming up and saying, oh, I just know that there's going to be 7 years of famine. But semantic on words there.
He didn't give him the ability necessarily to predict the future. He gave him the ability to interpret dreams, whatever the dream was.
And the dream was saying
The dream
what it was.
was that there's going to be 7 years of drought and 7
That's
years
what
of
Joseph.
That's what Joseph's dream needed interpreted.
Well, back in
Yes. But he didn't predict the future. He interpreted the dream, and the dream was saying what was going to happen down the road in the future.
One of our ways to future.
Tried to interpret dream, they couldn't. But Daniel and them went to God with prayer and he gave it to them. The scholar couldn't do it.
they didn't have that ability.
Right. Make sense?
And Daniel wouldn't have had it if he hadn't faith in God.
Correct.
But it wasn't Daniel's dream, it was the king's dream.
Correct. We're getting ready to get into the king's dream. Yes. The story we're going to get into, Daniel did not have the dream. We're referring back to, for Mark there, referring to the dream that Joseph interpreted about the famine. But he didn't predict the future. He interpreted the dream, and the dream said what was going to happen in the future. Make sense? Right. To Mark.
The Daniel dreams is all later.
Yes.
So there, it's kind of semantics in a way. It's how, in what method does God reveal
Yes.
future
Right.
events? So in some cases, he did it through
Ezra.
Nebuchadnezzar's dream that Daniel interpreted, and later Daniel
His-
will have his
his
own
dreams.
dreams of God, where God will reveal some things about
Right.
things that are yet to come. So it is kind of,
Yeah.
yeah.
The future is predicted by the interpretation of the dream. So it's just not like he woke up and says, oh, by the way, there's going to be such and such. This dream says feast or famine or whatever's going to happen. So, in a sense, yes, he predicted the future, but it's in the way of the interpretation of the dream. Did I satisfy your answer? I want happy students. Yes, I do, Mark. I really don't want to get into the dream right now. So we'll field a few more questions or we'll stop right here because I don't want to start chapter 2 for 5 minutes and you know, a bad place to break off, I believe. Any questions or comments? Yes.
You just mentioned, and I never heard that necessarily before, but did some of the Bible scholars think that this process that the young men went through was about 3 years?
Yes. Only for the simple fact, in verse 5, it says that they should be educated for 3 years. So we see it there, but the commentators, I said, it might have been a few months more, a few months less than that, depending on the training and how well they did in that. So it was approximately 3 years at that point. No. Hey, you'd be surprised how many times I went back and forth. Where'd that come from? Oh, yeah. But so it was approximately 3 years, which would in turn put them approximately 18 years of age at that point of their lives.
Not all of the young men from Israel made it.
Correct.
That's down in verse 19. Out of them all, not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and they entered the king's personal service.
Correct.
In a way, it could be not, we wish it had been a little clearer maybe, but from the reading of verse 19, the strong impression is they were the only 4 who entered the king's personal service, and the rest of these young Israeli men didn't.
Did not. So the training group of however many they took to begin with, that went through that 3-year program, he took the best of the best. Who he captured, the king, here's the best of what I see of you. You go through your training, he sorted them out again. Here's who's coming into my court, and Daniel and the 4 were the ones that were pointed out here. That it seems like those were the only ones that he took. Yes. Anything else this morning? Last chance. Thank you for being here. We'll continue on starting chapter 2 next week.